Hi, I'm going to talk about seed dispersal by Catapult, an experiment. By the end of this experiment, you will have made a seed catapult. I will first go over why plants catapult their seeds, how plants catapult their seeds, how catapults work, and the seed catapult experiment. So first of all, why do plants catapult or shoot their seeds? Look at this picture of the forest floor. Imagine you are standing under plants, even small flowers. This is what you would see. What do you see? Notice how there are patches of sunlight, but for the most part, the forest floor is shaded and dark, and not much is growing underneath the plants.
Plants need sunlight to grow. Plants need soil to grow. They need the nutrients and space to grow their roots. Ultimately, plants catapult their seeds so that the seeds can get far from the parent plant, so the plant can have enough resources of sunlight and soil to grow. So how do plants catapult their seeds? There are two main ways this happens. One is from water absorption. If you look at this picture here, you can see the cell, and that cell starts to absorb water, and it fills up with more and more water until that seed pod is ready to pop or burst. And it's kind of similar to a balloon. If you fill up the balloon with too much water, that balloon will pop. So the second way is by water evaporation. If you look at this picture, here's the cell, and the water is leaving or evaporating out of the cell. And so the cell starts to shrink and shrink as the water leaves, but the seeds are still in that plant.
There is high pressure just because there's less room for the seeds in that dehydrated or dried up seed pod.
And what happens again, you get high pressure, and eventually, just like the balloon with that high pressure, that seed pod will pop. Now, there are many examples in nature. I'm going to go over a few. One example is this plant here, where you can see that the plant is filling with water, and when it gets too full,
the seed pod falls off and the water and the seeds squirt out.
An example of this is a type of squash that you can see here in this picture. When it fills up with too much water, the squash bursts off and seeds pour out of the squash. Another example is pollen. Pollen does this a lot in nature, whereas the seed pod swells up, the pollen will eventually burst out. Mulberry is a great example of this. Round and round the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. That's the type of mulberry bush. And that flower, when it opens up, the pollen explodes or catapults out.
Here are close-up pictures of the flower, the mulberry flower, opening up. So you can see that the flower starts out closed up as a bud, and then as that pressure builds and builds and builds with more and more water going into that flower, the flower pops open, and that popping open and the extra pressure releases all that pollen in an explosion.
The last two examples were of water swelling up the plants. This is an example of the plants drying up, and as they dry up, there's less and less space, and then eventually those seeds shoot out. You actually see this with some spices such as star anise. Another example of the seed pod drying up, and then the seed pod curls and the seeds will shoot out. You actually see this one with okra, which is one of my favorite vegetables. So this version, the seed pod dries up and flies off the plant. You actually see this one with a lot of flowers and trees. Here is an example of a lupin flower. Here is the final example that I'm going to give. This one is actually a fern leaf that's curled up. And inside the leaf are seeds or the spores for the fern. And as the leaf starts to dry up, it dries up enough and it springs open and the spores are released. Here is a picture of a fern plant with the curled up leaf before the spores are released. Now that we've gone over a few examples of catapult style seed pods, let's talk about how catapults work. Catapults have 3 important parts. The first part is the lever arm. That is the long, flat part of the catapult. Next is the load, and that is whatever materials you're going to put into the catapult to shoot out. And finally, you have the fulcrum. And the fulcrum is something that the catapult will rotate on. Here is another example of a catapult. You'll notice the lever arm is that big flat looking stick. The load, it looks like a penny placed on it. And underneath the lever arm is the fulcrum, which the lever arm is going to pivot on. So what happens is you push down on the lever arm, and that lever arm rotates or pivots on the fulcrum, and the load gets shot out into the air. All right, let's begin the experiment on how to make a seed dispersal catapult. First, you will need to gather your materials. Here is a list of some example fulcrum materials, and it can be anything that can allow your lever to pivot on. So you can use a cork, a stack of popsicle sticks held together with rubber bands, blocks. It could be anything. Here are some examples of lever arm materials. It could be any stiff long item such as spoons of various sizes, popsicle sticks, rulers. Finally, you are going to need your load materials, and that's any item you want to catapult, such as seeds or seed bombs, pom-poms, balls. Once you have gathered your materials, you can go ahead and make a catapult. I'm going to show you some examples. One example is of a spoon that's been taped to a cork, or you can instead tie together with a rubber band popsicle sticks and use that as your fulcrum and insert the fulcrum between other popsicle sticks. You can also attach a spoon to the popsicle stick. In different ways you can do that. Once you have built a few designs for a catapult, I have some challenges for you. Try different lengths for your lever arm. Does your load travel farther with a longer or a shorter lever arm? Notice in this picture how there's 2 different sizes of spoons. So make a few catapult designs, test your designs out, and choose the design that shoots your load the furthest away. Finally, once you have your best design, go ahead and catapult your seeds or seed bombs into a garden flower bed nearby you. So the next time you're walking along and you see flowers, fruits, or vegetables, wonder if those plants have used catapult methods to disperse their seeds to faraway places, just like these violet flowers you are looking at.